That's okay. Well, look, thank you to the deputies and senators, and thank you, Chairman, for your comments. And maybe just to touch on that, I thank you for your support. I think Ireland has a unique opportunity to sell itself, but also to engage with member states, with nations, with countries across the world on St. Patrick's Day, and I really think it's an important opportunity for us to relay the best of what we have to offer in terms of our trade, business, but also culture and so many other key areas as well. So just to thank you for your comments on that. Senator Richmond, firstly in terms of the MFF and the timelines, I suppose initially while this discussion started almost 2 years ago, there would have been an ambition by the current Commission that it would be concluded and finalised before the European elections. But obviously, as we've seen in previous years and negotiations, it is extremely complex, and the added complexities of Brexit have pushed that out further. So we would agree in terms of trying to have a finalised political decision made by October. Obviously, there is engagement already happening with the European Parliament on specific areas or specific sectors or industries, but what we would hope is when that is agreed then in October and in the autumn time, that would then be passed on to the Parliament, obviously, where they would work on it also, and obviously it would have to be agreed. I myself have met with the chair of the Budget Committee from the Parliament and many others on this as well, so there's constant engagement at various different levels on the MFF. In terms of the Erasmus program, but obviously just to say, I think it's important that we do try and conclude it within a timely manner. The last MFF, a number of programmes were delayed in their starting because of the delay in agreeing the final overall budget, so it's important that we get it done on time. In terms of Erasmus and many other programmes, I absolutely agree with the Deputy. I think we need to highlight it more, and also the fact that Erasmus is not just for third level students, that it also now applies to those who are in traineeships, who are working in voluntary community organisations, those who are in primary school, secondary school, and there are so many more opportunities available. So I think it's important that we, through our educational platforms, but otherwise highlight the opportunities that are available. When we carried out the Future of Europe discussions throughout the country, the one thing that people highlighted and which became clear to us in the discussions was that a lot of what Europe is doing people weren't aware of, and that we need to communicate better. And so in that regard, as part of our overall discussion and our presentation that we'll make to the Council meeting in Sibiu on the 9th of May, we've started engaging with all of our departments, and that would include the Department of Education and others, to identify how they could better communicate their own connections with Europe, or what it is that people can benefit through European programmes like Erasmus Plus and others, and we've had engagement already and hope to have further engagement with departments on that. Senator Richmond, in terms of the rule of law in Hungary, and I suppose what are the sanctions, we have to adhere to the process that is currently there. What we've seen in terms of the engagement with Poland is that we have seen results in certain areas. We have seen changes reversed, or we have seen new legislation introduced on the basis of the hearings that we've had. As I've said, I myself have contributed to 5 different hearings engaging with our Polish colleagues and the Commission, and I think we need to allow that process to take place for Hungary as well. This is obviously something which was presented to the Council through the European Parliament. There was an initial discussion as to how that in itself would be brought forward, because this was new, but I think following on from yesterday's discussion, the current presidency has said that this will continue to be an issue, that we must continue to raise it, and as I said myself yesterday, there are concerns there, but of course Hungary has asked for fair process and due process to be able to address questions that people have raised, and people certainly do have questions. In terms of the alliances, you know, many have mentioned this, we are losing one of our closest neighbours, friends, allies in terms of the UK, and of course we want to continue to be able to work with them on key issues, but when it comes to the European Council, the General Affairs, the Agricultural Committees, whatever it is our ministers will be attending, they will not be around the table, and so it's important that we do have other alliances, whether it's in terms of financial issues, tax, the next MFF, agricultural issues, or indeed the digital single economy. In terms of the D9 group that's set up, we are actively engaged in various different groups, but also discussions with member states from across the whole of the European Union, and I think it's extremely important that we continue that, and where we can find find commonalities, that we work with each other at the same time without creating any divisions between the European Union and its member states. In terms of the Western Balkans, and again I think it is extremely important that we continue to show support for those member states looking to join the European Union. While one member state is unfortunately looking to leave, there are many others who see the European Union as the way forward and as a way for their country to develop and to prosper and to grow, and particularly their young people. Last year I travelled to Albania, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and this year Albania and North Macedonia. And what is very clear is that if the European Union does not continue to engage and to open up a process for those member states to move along the path to accession, then other countries and other regions will, and obviously we need to make sure that we continue that engagement. My visit to the Western Balkans this year was with my Finnish colleague, and I think it's important that we don't just, as individual member states, develop those relationships, but also that we work together to show unity from the European Union as a whole. In terms of Brexit discussions, the Commission's thoughts on where we are, what we're doing, the general mood. I think the general mood is that of frustration at the moment. To be honest, the Commission's thoughts on what we are doing and where we are as a country. I think the Commission is continuing to encourage all Member States to prepare in the best way that they can. Obviously, the work that we are doing is not necessarily what other Member States need to do, but we are trying to make sure, in as much as we can, everything that we do is in parallel with the work that the Commission is doing. And so there is constant engagement to make sure that we are working in parallel, and that anything that they are working on we can then replicate here where we need to also. In terms of Senator Crockwell, what steps have been taken in terms of customs? Obviously, the officials that have been hired in terms of the East-West and the possible complications in terms of freight transport or having to provide documentation which wasn't there before. I think most importantly our focus is ensuring that businesses are prepared and are able to actually have the documentation and to prepare in that way. In that regard, Revenue have been taking part in an outreach programme more recently, since the central case planning has been ramped up to implementation of a no-deal scenario, and they are engaging with small and medium enterprises, but also have engaged with a significant number of larger companies well, to make sure that they have the correct expertise and knowledge to be able to deal with any of these possible changes that may happen. And I think what's important to stress is that even in a deal scenario, there will be some additional paperwork required and some changes to the way that people are doing business. So it's important that they avail of this, irrespective of whether they feel there's going to be a deal or a no deal, because it will be important either way. In terms of sending soldiers or identifying places for posts, this is simply not happening and not something that we are considering. We're not considering anything in terms of a wall or otherwise, and we have consistently said that and consistently repeated that there is an onus on the UK to fulfil its obligations as co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, and the invisible border that currently exists is integral to the Good Friday Agreement and it being successful, or continuing to be successful. In terms of funding, the mismatch of funding in Brexit in terms of peace and interreg or communities in the north, of course that is a significant challenge. If the UK were to leave without a deal, we do not know whether or not, and this comes back maybe to the funding on the question on the MFF and what would happen next. We would have to find out from the UK as to what funding they wanted to continue to pay. Obviously, the Prime Minister has been clear that there are certain programmes they want to leave, whether it's CAP or the Common Fisheries Policy, but there are other areas that they have consistently stated they wanted to remain a part of, peace and interreg being one of them, and they have already given a commitment to continue that funding and co-funding with Ireland and the European Union, but also in terms of Erasmus, in terms of Horizon 2020, in terms of social and educational programmes. So really, until we hear from the UK as to what it is that they would be continuing to fund or not, then obviously it's very hard to identify where the gaps might or might not be. But obviously we will continue to fund the Peace and Interreg programme and any other programmes that require a cross-party or cross-North-South support. In terms of solidarity within the EU, support is strong from all Member States. As I said, I think there is a frustration, but there is certainly clarity from all of my colleagues that I've spoken to as recently as yesterday that the withdrawal agreement must remain as is, that the backstop, the Irish protocol and the issues discussed in terms of financial settlement and citizens' rights cannot be reopened, but obviously there is an opportunity to focus on the future relationship and possible changes to that. I think it's also important to mention, because Senator Craughwell mentioned maybe the European elections coming up and solidarity being strong, but that there are, I suppose, different fractions within European member states that are possibly moving more towards the left or right. Any colleague I have engaged with and asked in terms of the future of Europe discussions, in terms of support for the European Union, I haven't heard any say that support is less than 60% in any member state, while obviously ours is quite high at 90%. Most member states are 60, 70 or 80% supportive of the European Union, and I think through that engagement and through the process on the future of Europe, we can only hopefully increase that number in all member states, including Ireland as well. In terms of a border poll, again, I'd want to reiterate what Senator Craughwell has said. It's not the time for a border poll. It's certainly not on this government's agenda, and it's not going to be in terms of the overall discussions that we're having, whether there is a deal or a no deal. Civic groups from the unionist and nationalist community, I suppose that the question was in terms of people feeling that they don't have representation. The best way to address that is for there to be a functioning executive for the Northern Ireland Assembly, which is 2 years and 1 month, a world record for a region not to be or to be without a government. It is extremely important that that executive is up and running, and that groups like the Ulster Farmers Union, like Retail Northern Ireland, like the various different groups that have come out in support of the withdrawal agreement, that they feel that they have a voice as well. Deputy Durkin, in terms of your question, do we have enough investment in place for hauliers? Do we have enough investment in place for hauliers? Again, I suppose to go back to my initial statement, we are investing in as much as we can to ensure that at our own ports that the facilities and the space and the mechanisms are in place, whether it's people working, obviously, customs officials or SPS checks, or else the space that we need in terms of lay-bys or expanding the overall parameters of the various different ports. What we cannot predict and what we don't know is in terms of those who continue through the land bridge in the UK as to what the impact will be on them. We can prepare on our own ports. We can also engage with our European colleagues, which we have done from France and Belgium, being the two main ones, to try and ensure that when Irish trucks arrive, that they might perhaps have a faster lane or a specific lane to drive through. However, we have no such commitment or communication in terms of the UK, and I would find it very difficult to believe that Irish hauliers would have a quicker pass through the Channel Tunnel than the UK hauliers, and that's obviously one of the biggest challenges that we face. Of course, we are also ensuring that even in a no-deal scenario, there is a reciprocal arrangement which would ensure that UK hauliers could continue to travel through the EU, and obviously that would work vice versa. But again, that's not going to replace what we currently have. It's not going to be as good as the status quo, so that is the biggest challenge that we face. But we are working with hauliers who really are at the front line in terms of a lot of the chains that we talk about, and it's important that they understand what supports are available to them and what is happening. The 300 million Brexit loan scheme fund, my understanding at the moment is as of the 28th of January, 338 firms have been approved. This is ranging across departments or business from the agri-food sector, retail, distribution, manufacturing, we have hospitality, transport sector, and we have a further 36 applications which are currently being processed. This is to the value of 15.34 million have already been sanctioned, so obviously there is still a substantial amount of funding there, but in that regard I would encourage companies who feel that this is something that they need to avail of to apply, and obviously we're trying to move these along as quickly as possible. There are other supports available as well, and at a European level, Minister Heather Humphreys has been given permission from the Commission in terms of a rescue and restructuring fund to work with the European or with Enterprise Ireland, which would again provide further support for small and medium enterprises who are currently feeling that their business and the survival of their business is at threat. There's a second one then where it isn't as severe, but where that additional support can be and ceilings can be lifted by Enterprise Ireland. In terms of CAP, again, you mentioned food security. Absolutely, we have consistently stated our position in terms of the next MFF. That is why we have consistently said that we would be willing to pay the 1.1% instead of the 1% proposed by the Commission at the moment. But obviously we would want to ensure that our traditional priorities are protected, and that includes CAP. But also, as you have mentioned, this is not just for our own farmers and our own Indigenous industry, which is extremely important. This is about food security, this is about food hygiene, this is about health. And I think we have a real opportunity now in terms of how we connect that with our discussion on research and innovation, but also climate change, and how our own farmers here have been and can continue to be champions of change in all of those areas, and to continue to produce food in the most sustainable way, as they always have done. In terms of the UK, are they being reminded of the seriousness of the Good Friday Agreement? Absolutely. While it's not for us to interfere in the political process in the UK, and we have not, it is within our right, I believe, to remind them of their obligations as co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, and we continue to do that in every way that we can. Again, in terms of European support, absolutely steadfast. I believe it's very strong. And again, yes, you know, it's clear to see yesterday, while we might disagree on certain issues and we might disagree on certain processes, the solidarity on this particular issue and the unity of the EU27 has been very strong. Senator Layden, in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and its standing irrespective of Brexit, absolutely, I agree with that, and I think we need to continue to develop the relationships that we've had. That's why our ministers are continuing to engage with UK ministers, albeit separate to the Brexit negotiations, which are being handled by Michel Barnier and his team at a European level. It's fair to say that relationships are somewhat strained, which is, I think, only natural when a negotiation is underway. But we have been very clear that we want the progress that we have made in recent years in our relationship to continue, and that obviously post-Brexit we will continue to use the ways and means which we have already through our various different committees and formats to continue that engagement, and possibly those committees formed from the Good Friday Agreement could be used as a way of engaging when they are now not around the table at the Council meetings. The bill we of course wanted to pass in time, and we thank all of the deputies and all parties for their support on that, and obviously we will do everything we can to ensure that it is implemented on time, and if it's not needed for the 29th of March, then it will of course be there for when it is needed. In terms of goods, I just need to see the question. Again, I suppose this comes back to our hauliers and being able to ensure that goods can get to the EU as quickly as possible. The Department of Transport has done a huge amount of work in terms of the sea transport. We have a new vessel, the WB Yates, which has been launched, which can now carry 3 times the amount as its predecessor, which obviously is significant, but at the same time, when you have certain perishable goods that can only be delivered or that need a 20-hour turnaround time, as opposed to others that maybe could work within the 40 or 60-hour turnaround time, depending on the boat in question, then obviously the land bridge is going to be the quickest. But it goes back to then the challenge we face in terms of what happens when they get to the UK. But we're doing everything we can to try and address that. The Article 50 extension, again, this is something the Prime Minister as recently as last week has said that she is not going to ask for, and until they ask for that, obviously we can't predict what will happen there. Of course, if they do, we have always said we would look upon it favourably, but I think, again, speaking to colleagues in the last few days, our EU colleagues and the Commission would want to know that there is a reason as to why there's going to be an extension, and obviously that we're not going to end up in the same place as we are now, but in 3 months' time, prolonging the uncertainty for so many businesses and people. Again, the green card, this is something that insurance companies are taking on board based on what was previously in place prior to membership of the European Union. My understanding is that they will begin to engage with all of their customers at the beginning of March if a deal has not been agreed to or if we have not seen progress, and obviously it's additional paperwork. It's not what people want to be doing, but it's obviously a contingency plan that's in place. Again, Hungary, we will continue to engage on that and continue to voice our concerns on the many different issues, whether it's the the voluntary or community organisations that have been impacted, we feel, by the recent legislation, whether it's the university's move now being situated in Vienna, or the courses having to take place in Vienna, or obviously the developments in recent times of the government-funded campaign against the President of the European Commission. Deputy Haughey, again, continue to alliance build. As I've set out, we have, through our various different engagements, whether it's on the MFF, the digital agenda, the agricultural ministers, or else the finance and taxation issues, we are continuing to engage, but also on a one-to-one basis, and that's why I'll be travelling to Lithuania and Latvia next week. That's why the Taoiseach will continue his engagement across all of the European member states. The rule of law in Poland, you specifically mentioned, will continue in the way that we have, but obviously I think there is a frustration that this process has been ongoing for some time now, and while we have seen significant developments, not enough progress has been made in certain areas. So this is something that we need to work together on to try and see, I think, a conclusion sooner rather than later. MFF in the event of a no deal, again, the contribution from the UK and what that would look like, we will have to wait and see what that would be the case, whether they would continue to pay even in the event of a no-deal scenario. In terms of the future of Europe, Sibiu, Romania, the event on the 9th of May, we hope to publish that in April, and I would also hope that there would be a debate in the Dáil, so that everybody would be able to, and the Senate, everybody would be able to engage in it, contribute to it before this is then presented by the Taoiseach on the 9th of May. Deputy Coughlin, then again, in terms of, I suppose this is, I don't want to repeat myself, but again, in terms of the hauliers and ensuring that our exports to the EU reach the EU in as quick a time as possible. Obviously, we're doing everything, as I've just outlined, from the work on our ports to engaging with our EU colleagues to additional ships to various other ways as well. We're trying to engage on that. The likelihood of an extension, again, that the UK have not said that they are going to ask for it, so unless they do, it's very hard to deal with that. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Minister.